The reason changing the score doesn't change the game is because ultimately your results are not the same thing as your performance. And to explain that, what I mean is that when we think about performance, there are loads of different domains of performance, whether it's cost, whether it's revenue, whether it's morale, whether it's service quality, or I mean, you name it, there's an abundance of them. And while we may want to adopt a perspective which is, you know, we want to be customer centric or value focused or these sorts of things, and that's all good, that doesn't mean other things don't matter. Cost, risk, revenue, etc. So all of these different domains of performance matter, and measuring them as if they're separate from one another actually draws our focus into something quite narrow, and we end up missing what I call performance in the round, which is the way that all these different elements come together in a way that is either functional and performant or dysfunctional and unperformant. So performance, I want to suggest to you, is how these things come together in the round and around a social purpose, i.e. something that's of value to the world. Measuring any individual domain of performance, in other words, a result, is not measuring performance. Now that's quite important, because when we think about what we tend to do, organizations tend to treat performance management as the management of results. It's Deliverology. The job is to deliver the results. And what happens when we do that is we actually narrow our focus. We end up prioritizing some results over other results, some domains over other domains. And as a result, we actually distort performance in the round, which leaves our organizations off balance and firefighting, and actually can make them a less than humane place as well. Okay. So the lessons I take from that little image are that treating performance as a score to be kept only turns it into a game to be played. Now, I can give you an illustration of that in practice. Let's imagine we've got a very senior leader in an organization doing one of those sort of big annual town hall events, and they're talking about how brilliantly we've done this year, and they're talking about how, you know, we've managed to draw in 25% more revenue, and we've improved morale by 15%, and they're quoting numbers at us. But that's not the same as talking about performance. And I've seen these town hall events where leaders stand up and proclaim great results. And I've watched the audience, and the audience who experience the reality of performance in the round look at them as if they've gone mad. Look at them as if they're not connected to reality, because they're talking about numbers, not about performance. And the danger of this is that what it does is it actually not only creates a sense that leadership may be disconnected from real world performance, but also it sort of communicates to people that what we are involved in when we talk about performance is a game to be played, a position to be taken, not something true about the world to be discovered and talked about and made sense of. So in other words, it creates organizations that are, first of all, full of fake news, numbers in place of performance. And it creates organizations that are essentially post-truth, that we're not really trying to get to the heart of the matter. We're not really trying to talk about performance. We're just trying to tell a good story using whatever numbers we can. So that might sound really cynical, but I think we've probably all seen examples of that at times. What's the second lesson we can take from this? Well, it's that improving each thing makes everything worse. So that idea of improving separate domains of performance is not improving performance, it's improving results. It's delivery, but not impact. And this is, I think, really important, because in organizations, we are inevitably designed into roles and functions and services and essentially all sorts of little silos. And performance management, as it's historically been, has been focused on how do we do our bit well. But doing our bit well is not the same as doing the right thing. And if we're not careful, we end up squeezing the balloon, we end up making our bit really efficient, but at the expense of the whole thing being effective. So we move problems around the system. And to bring it to the level of individual human experiences. And this is the bit that's sometimes most controversial for people. I want to suggest to you that the stuff that gets done in the name of, for example, population health, because I know many of you are in that sphere, is, I think, really dangerous, because populations don't experience outcomes, people do. And what I mean by that is that the same problem I'm diagnosing of focusing on results over performance recurs at the level of how we think about outcomes. So in healthcare, when we think about an outcome such as reducing obesity, or we think about an outcome such as improving the survival rate from cancer, those feel like things that are so unquestionable that of course they have to be good. And yet the reality is, if we think about cancer survival, my survival post-cancer treatment, the outcome I experience as a human being isn't just that I survive. It isn't just that one domain, that one metric. It's linked into what's the quality of life I have after surviving treatment, what's the quality of life I have during treatment, what does treatment require of me and my family and others around me, and so on and so forth. So actually, the notion of an outcome as a single measurable thing, such as reduced obesity or increased survival rate, is actually not an outcome at all. It's the same mistake of confusing results with performance. Confusing a single domain for an experiential outcome is a nonsense in actual fact. Therefore, I want to suggest to you that there is no such thing as a population outcome. And if we're really interested in outcomes, we need to be in the business of sense making, not scorekeeping. So this is the negative thesis, but if I was to sum up the negative thesis, it's this. And this is why I think current performance management approaches are essentially inhumane. What happens is they encourage us to strip away the nuance of the fact that everything is connected and behave as if the results that we get are the performance that matters. And it's simply not true. Okay, so where does it leave us and what can we do about it? Well, in simple terms, I'm suggesting we need to get away from scorekeeping and into sense making. So the job is, how do we make sense of the world around us and what performance in the round looks like? And yes, we're going to use data to help us answer that question, but we're not going to treat that data as a score. Another way to make the same point is that we need to individually take personal responsibility for how we are understanding and evaluating performance, because it is so complex that no one can impose a single evaluation criteria or a single set of evaluation criteria. Because whenever we look from here, we're not looking from there, so we need to take the time to look from there. And whenever we look from there, we're not looking from this other point. So actually, understanding performance in the round is about sort of a practice of empathy. It's putting ourselves in different perspectives to understand what does the world look like from those different perspectives, and how does that come together in our own minds as an act of judgment, as an act of synthesis, pulling together an understanding of performance. Okay, so that may sound slightly esoteric, difficult to grasp, and the reality is that is what performance is. It's quite difficult to grasp. It's not a fixed position. It's an interpretation in the world. And of course, some interpretations are not valid, yeah, because you can't say your business is performing well while it's in the process of going bust, yeah. So not all evaluations are valid, but neither is there a definitive evaluation that says we're performing well. The job is making sense, not keeping score. Okay. So hopefully you're sticking with me. How do we take those thoughts and now put them into practice? Well, the stuff that Jeremy and I do is focused around how do we turn performance into a conversation rather than into a sort of fixed point of data in a scorecard or something like that. And what we've seen is there are three headline types of conversation that are most useful and really important to have in your organization. And these may not be too surprising to you. So the first type is check-in conversations, where we get together with people that we're working with and we make sense of what's going on. And in terms of the archetype of that conversation, we're asking questions like this, you know, what's happening, what's not happening that should be happening, what can we do to influence that, and what help do we need to have that influence? Now, I'm going to be more specific about check-in conversations in a minute, but they all follow that rough archetype. The second kind of conversation we have when we're sense making is check-out conversations. And these are conversations that in my experience almost never happen. And Saskia and I have used them, and you know, you can talk about them in a minute, Saskia, if you want to, but the point of a check-out conversation is once we've done the work of sense making together and we've started to form a bit of a view of what we think is happening and not happening and what we could do, the easiest thing to do is to then leave the room assuming that we're all on the same page, and to leave the room assuming that there hasn't been anything that was felt to be undiscussable, that we just kind of brushed under the carpet and felt was too awkward to share. So check-out conversations are about being deliberate in creating the space, and it can be just a few minutes at the end of a conversation or meeting, but being deliberate to create the space for people to say, actually, you know what, I'm still not clear, or I'm still not comfortable, or actually, yeah, I get what it is we're setting out to achieve, but actually I'm not feeling very committed to that because there's this other stuff we haven't discussed yet, and it feels important. So what Jeremy and I have learned to do in our work at Easier Inc. is to try and make a real habit of check-out conversations. Every time you have a conversation with someone or a meeting with someone, before you leave, taking just a few minutes to make sure we're clear, we're comfortable, and we're committed or enthusiastic. And then there's a third kind of conversation we've learned is really important that also doesn't really happen in our experience, which we might call check that conversations. And what we mean by these is something quite specific, which is in many organizations, there's lots of checking that things are happening. But usually what we're checking is that people are following the procedure, that they're compliant, or that they're delivering the results. What we mean by check that conversations is that we're checking that the way we check in with each other and the way we check out with each other is systematic. So it's not ad hoc. It's not just an accident that we sometimes do it and sometimes don't. That it's empathetic, that we really take the time to hear each other and to put ourselves in each other's shoes and to put ourselves in the shoes of people who may not be present in those meetings and conversations. And that it's empirical. So as we take the time to listen to each other, we're disciplined in trying to not just let opinions slide into the conversation. We want to hear opinions, but then we want to test those opinions against, okay, but how are we confirming that that's true? How are we using data to check whether we're right? How are we going out into the workplace to directly observe what's happening and validate the assumptions we're making? So check that conversations are essentially saying, how do we check that the environment we're creating through these conversations is one that's systematic, empathetic, and empirical, because we know that if they are, then we will have a healthy organization, and guess what? Better outcomes grow from healthy systems. So the key here is we're using check that conversations to systematize check in and check out, to create healthy environments, because we know that's what good performance emerges out of. So the counterintuitive thing for some people is we're not actually managing performance here. We're managing the environment that produces performance. And that's the big shift away from results and into the environments that create them. Okay. I said that there's these three conversations at a sort of archetype level. The other thing that we've learned is that those three conversations happen in slightly different contexts. And there are many, many contexts, but there are 5 that we've seen that are kind of predictable, and really it pays to pay attention to them. So there are conversations around purpose, you know, what are we here to do? There are conversations that are roughly around people, which might be at the level of kind of stakeholder management. So who are all the people that matter and what matters to them? But it might also be at the level of individuals. So how am I doing in my job, and how am I meeting my aspirations and making the most of my needs and strengths and on track with my career or not? There are conversations around process, if you like. So this is basically, is the process by which we're working well? So if you're in pathology, for example, you know, are we doing the right tests at the right time in ways that provide valid results to clinicians and enable informed choices? Yeah. So process-focused conversations. Then progress-focused conversations. So we're trying to do stuff to improve. Are we getting it done? Is it improving? And then planning conversations, which is where we're essentially action planning or strategizing for how do we get from here to there. So these are different contexts in which we see check in, check out, and check that conversations happening. And I thought what I'd do is I'd share one of those contexts as a bit of a worked example so you can see what this looks like. And the one I'm going to pick is the one that I think in practice is probably most common and most productive in terms of day-to-day improvement work. So it's the progress conversations. And I'm going to start out with what a checkout practice could look like there. So let's imagine we're a project team, we're working together, and we are getting together for, let's say, our weekly check-in. And we're at the end of the check-in, we've had a discussion about what's going on, and before we leave, we want to be sure that, you know, we're really off to do the right things. So what we've learned works quite well in these sorts of conversations is not just to have a loose-limbed checkout where we say, are we all okay? Are we comfortable? But actually to use some statements to really surface the discomfort. And the statements can be whatever you find useful in your context, but these are ones that we've found are quite often useful in different contexts. So what we do is, if I'm facilitating, I would say to each of you as a group, I'm going to read out these statements, and as I read them out, I want you to score them from 1 to 5 based on gut feel, not using your head, just your gut. And I'm going to read them out quickly because I want you to score them quickly. And I'm inviting you to feel lots of permission to give whatever score you want, because the scores aren't what matter. What matters is that we have a conversations about what we need to do to be able to leave the room feeling 5 out of 5. So I would read out these statements and you would score them, and then on a flip chart or a whiteboard, I would invite you to shout out your scores, one statement at a time, doing a round robin. And what I've experienced of this is it's kind of really interesting and quite counterintuitive, which is even if people give scores that are, if you like, not what they feel in their gut. So they say, for example, well, I'll never give a 5 because nothing's ever perfect. Or they've opted for the easy option with a 3 because they don't want to say it's really a 2. Yeah. Even if they do those things, what happens is predictably, you see patterns because you're going round the room and everybody's given their score, and you see that basically we're comfortable because it's all 4s and 5s, so let's not worry about it. Or actually there's a bit of variety because we've got a few 3s and we've got a 1 and we've got a 5. And the point is, it immediately throws into our face that we're leaving the room, if we don't have this conversation, in a position that doesn't set us up for success. So actually the scores are completely arbitrary. They're just a way of showing that we've got variety in our perspectives and we're not ready to leave the room. So in the checkout conversation, we use this approach. We call it confirmation practices. It's confirming that against a set of statements that we think describe how we want to leave the room, we're either on track or off track. And that gives us permission to have a really quick conversation around, well, okay, so if we're not happy that we're working on the right things, where have we gone off track? What do we need to do to bring ourselves around? Do we need to schedule another meeting, or can we solve this quickly? And as Saskia may tell you, I mean, my personal experience of this is in the last 10 minutes of a meeting or so, doing this almost always allows me to leave the room feeling like we're on track and able to leave productively. So it usually doesn't lead to follow-up meetings and all the rest of it. Okay, conscious of time, that's a checkout practice. So what would a check-in practice for the same context look like? Well, it may be unsurprising, but it actually looks exactly the same. So when we get together as a project team, I might get you to give the scores against the statements at the start. And then we'll talk about, okay, so what does that mean for us? And then we'll come up with actions and an adjustment in our focus and so on. And then we'll do the checkout and make sure that the conversation we've had met its purpose. So that's one way we could do a check-in conversation. Another way that I sometimes use is just to use a grid like this and say, okay, folks, so you're arriving into the room, you kind of know what's going on in your life. So what's going on in your life, what's bubbling? And I'll invite people to just think for a minute, capture some post-its, and then plot them into this matrix. And the matrix is just to help us prioritize what we're going to talk about first. So we'll talk about the quick stuff first, and then we'll talk about the important stuff that's really involved next. And if we have time, we'll talk about involved stuff that's interesting last. That's just a way of making sure that we get the big things, the important things dealt with while we're together in the meeting. And of course, lastly, you can combine those two approaches that are on screen. You can say, well, we're going to populate our little matrix, but we're going to do it by asking you to think about these statements and capture things that you want to talk about into the matrix based on those statements. So again, the kind of process here, or the logic here, is to use statements that describe what we think good would look like as we leave the room, as a way of provoking us into discussing the things that are maybe difficult to discuss or important to discuss. We're using the matrix to help us prioritize that so we get through the important work first. And then we're checking out at the end to make sure we leave the room in fit shape to be able to go and do good work. And while we do all of that, we can also do the check that bit. And we can do the check that bit in a couple of ways. We can do it by asking ourselves, you know, were we systematic there? Were we empathetic? Were we empirical? The key check that questions. Or we can simply make sure that in the last 30 seconds before we leave the room, having done the check-in and the check-out, we just say, so can we just validate, are we leaving here 5 out of 5 now that we've done that mopping up work in our checkout process? Or do we still have some problems we need to work on? And if we still have some problems, well, we're not going to have an infinitely long meeting. But what we're doing is we're at least recognizing that we're not leaving the meeting set up for success. And we might decide together that we either need another meeting, or we might say to each other, well, actually, given that we've just done a check-in and a check-out and we've not reached 5 out of 5, does that tell us something about how we've had the conversation and whether we had it in the right way? Because if it does, maybe we need to spend some time in a subsequent meeting talking about how we talk to each other. Yeah. So this is a way of, in really simple but quite systematic terms, helping us to surface what's going on in our work, helping us to talk about the reality of performance, not the fiction of results. And it's a way of trying to force us to discuss the undiscussable. So I'm going to kind of wrap up there because I'm over time, but there are other things that we can talk about if you want to hang on around tactical considerations like doing this in teams versus as one-to-ones, or manager versus, you know, buddy. Whether you capture these conversations or leave them anonymous, and scores whether they're anonymous or not, whether you record them. What I'm going to send you following this call, though, is I'll send you the slides, and I'll also send you a resource sheet that has some resources in it for how to do this for yourself. So you can kind of read a bit more and practice this. And you're welcome to call us anytime if you want just a one-to-one chat about how to do it in your own work. So hopefully this has been a useful session for you. That's the summary slide there. Our contact details will be in the slide deck too, so you can get in touch with me and Jeremy. And as I say, please do feel free to stay on if you would like to have a conversation. Otherwise, thanks for taking the time to join us today.